The moment you stepped through that classroom door in the 1970s, the world outside seemed to fade away. Sunlight streamed across rows of wooden desks. Chalk dust hung gently in the air, and the faint clink of tiny milk bottles echoed from the hall. Coats dripped quietly in the cloakroom, radiators hissed, and the low hum of chatter filled the space before the teacher arrived. It was a simpler time, strict yet comforting, ordinary yet unforgettable. Today, we turn the pages of memory and walk once more into those halls to relive 20 moments from the British classroom we'll never forget. Number 20. End of term cleaning. The last day of term had its own special energy, part excitement, part nostalgia, and a dash of chaos. Lessons were shorter, and there was a sense that the rules had loosened just a little. But before freedom came, there was work to be done, the great classroom clean. Chairs were stacked on top of desks, books sorted into neat piles, and cupboards cleared of forgotten exercise books, broken rulers, and dried-up glue sticks. Someone always found a long-lost pen or a sweet wrapper from months ago, crumpled and faded. Teachers handed out damp cloths to wipe down surfaces, and the smell of polish filled the air. The braver pupils got to use the heavy floor buffer, a noisy, clunky machine that left the linoleum shining like new. There was laughter, teasing, and a lot of look what I found moments. And when it was done, you'd stand for a moment in the clean, empty room, knowing you wouldn't see it again for weeks. Walking out into the sunshine felt like stepping into another world. The term was over, the summer was ahead, and for that moment everything felt light, free, and endless. Number 19. Teachers' copperplate handwriting. Some teachers had handwriting so beautiful it felt like art. Flowing, elegant loops in perfect copperplate script, every letter balanced and precise. Watching them write on the blackboard was almost hypnotic, the chalk gliding in smooth arcs, forming words that looked like they belonged in a fine wedding invitation. They made it look effortless. No smudges, no uneven spacing, just pure, graceful writing from start to finish. And when they turned back to the class, chalk in hand, you'd find yourself almost afraid to copy it in case you spoiled its perfection on your own page. For pupils, it set the standard. The expectation wasn't just to write legibly, it was to write beautifully. Handwriting lessons weren't simply about forming letters, they were about discipline, patience, and pride in your work. Over time, some of us improved, our script becoming neater and more fluid. Others never quite managed the same flair, but we still admired it from afar. Even now, seeing that style in an old birthday card or a handwritten letter can bring back a rush of classroom memories. The scratch of chalk, the faint squeak as it caught on the board, and the quiet elegance of words made by hand. Number 18. Singing times tables. If you learned your times tables in the 1970s, chances are you learned them in song. The whole class would chant together, voices rising and falling in perfect unison. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. It wasn't just a maths lesson, it was almost musical. Some teachers used a steady clap or tapped a ruler on the desk to keep everyone in time. Others made it a bit more fun, turning it into a race to see who could say them the fastest without stumbling. Even the shy pupils found themselves joining in. The group rhythm pulled you along. It was repetitive, yes, but it worked. Long before anyone talked about learning styles, teachers instinctively knew that rhythm and repetition made things stick. And stick they did. Decades later, you could still rattle off your sevens without thinking. There was something comforting about that daily chant, too. Everyone saying the same words at the same time made you feel part of the team. It didn't matter if you were top of the class or barely keeping up. For those few minutes, you were all in sync, moving together through the numbers. Number 17. Timetables on the wall. Before apps, before digital screens, every class had its timetable pinned to the wall or written in neat chalk on a corner of the blackboard. It was the weekly rhythm of your life. Monday mornings with maths, history before lunch, PE on Wednesdays. The timetable was like a promise and a warning. You could glance at it first thing and know whether the day ahead would be fun or a slog. Double games? Great. Double maths? Not so much. Most were handwritten, often decorated with colored borders or underlines. If a teacher was feeling generous, they'd draw little doodles, a football for PE, a book for English. And when lessons changed, the whole thing would be rubbed out and rewritten, a new version to memorize. Pupils soon learned it by heart, but the timetable's presence on the wall was oddly reassuring. It was a constant in a world that was otherwise full of small surprises, fire drills, visiting inspectors, or sudden changes in seating plans. Looking back, it's funny how something so simple could feel so important. That rectangle of paper or chalk grid wasn't just a schedule, it was the backbone of the school week, keeping our little world turning. Number 16. The smell of wet coats. Rain was just part of school life in Britain. On wet days, the cloakroom became a sensory memory all of its own. You'd walk in and be hit by that unmistakable smell, damp wool, soggy wellies, and the faint tang of wet leather from satchels. The pegs were crammed with coats, some dripping onto the floor, creating little puddles that would soak your socks if you weren't careful. Scarves and gloves hung in limp, damp bunches, and there was always one coat with a hood so soaked it felt like touching a sponge. By the time the bell rang for lessons, the cloakroom air was heavy with moisture, and the smell would drift into the classroom, mingling with the scent of pencil shavings and floor polish. Sometimes, on particularly wet days, you'd be allowed to keep your coat on for the first few minutes of class to warm up. The radiators steamed them dry, releasing bursts of that earthy, rainy smell. It wasn't glamorous, but it was part of school life, one of those little discomforts we accepted without question, and one of the clearest scents that can still take you right back to childhood. Number 15. Classroom monitors. Being chosen as a classroom monitor was a badge of honor. There were different roles: milk monitor, board cleaner, register carrier, and each came with its own tiny perks. If you were the milk monitor, you got to leave lessons a few minutes early to fetch the crates from the hallway. The register carrier meant a short walk to the school office, a chance to peek into the staff room and smell the strong aroma of teachers' coffee. The board cleaner's job was messier, clapping the felt erasers outside until chalk dust coated your hands. But you didn't mind, because for those few minutes you weren't stuck behind your desk. Monitors got a taste of responsibility, and even if the job was simple, it felt like trust. Sometimes teachers would choose the same reliable pupils. Other times they'd surprise the class by picking someone new, just to give them a chance. Those moments, carrying the register down an empty corridor, the echo of your footsteps, the pride in doing something important, stayed with you. It was a small taste of independence in a world where most of your day was ruled by bells and timetables. Number 14. Handwriting practice books. In the 1970s, handwriting was more than just a skill. It was an art form. Every pupil had a handwriting practice book, its pages lined with faint blue guides to help form perfect loops and curves. The aim was clear: neat, joined-up writing in the classic cursive style, with no smudges or uneven letters. You dip your pen, or later, click your biro and trace careful lines across the page, repeating the same letters over and over. A, O, until your hand ached. Teachers would walk between desks, peering over shoulders, praising the neat ones and gently tusking at the ones who rushed. There was a quiet rhythm to it, the scratch of pen on paper, the occasional sigh when you made a mistake and had to start again. Some pupils loved it, taking pride in every stroke. Others found it slow torture. By the end of the term, your book was a record of progress, from wobbly, hesitant lines to confident, flowing script. And though we didn't realize it then, those lessons in patience, care, and presentation stayed with us long after we left the classroom. Number 13. Nature tables. Every primary classroom seemed to have one. The nature table. Usually placed near the window, it was a small wooden surface covered in treasures from the outside world. In autumn, it might be stacked with shiny brown conkers, crisp orange leaves, and spiky horse chestnut shells. In spring, there'd be daffodils in a jam jar or a sprig of blossom from someone's garden. Some pupils brought in pine cones, feathers, or unusual stones they'd found on the walk to school. Occasionally, there was a jam jar of pond water, home to tadpoles or tiny water insects that we'd check every day to see if anything had changed. The nature table wasn't just decoration, it was a source of quiet wonder. Teachers used it to start conversations about the seasons, wildlife, and the environment, long before eco-friendly was a common phrase. Sometimes the table would smell faintly of damp earth or wildflowers, a reminder that the outside world was always just beyond the classroom walls. And for many of us, those small hands-on discoveries were more exciting than any textbook, because they were real, right there in front of us, and we'd brought them in with our own hands. Number 12. Chalk-covered teacher's gown. Some teachers in the 1970s still wore the traditional black academic gown, a habit that seemed both grand and slightly intimidating. It would billow behind them as they strode down the corridor, the fabric swishing with each step. But in the classroom, those gowns told a different story. They were magnets for chalk dust. By the middle of a lesson, the once black fabric would be dusted with white smudges, the edges of the sleeves marked where they'd brushed against the blackboard. Sometimes you'd see the ghost of a handprint on the back, from where they'd absent-mindedly leaned against the board while thinking. The gown made the teacher feel almost like a character from a different era, as if they'd stepped out of an old grammar school photograph. For us pupils, it was both a sign of authority and a strange source of comfort. You could spot your teacher instantly in the playground just by the sweep of black fabric. When the bell rang, they'd shake it off, sending little puffs of chalk into the air. That faint cloud would hang there for a moment, almost like the last word of the lesson before slowly settling over the desks. Number 11. School dinners on plastic trays. Lunchtime was its own kind of ritual. You joined the slow-moving queue, the smell of gravy and boiled vegetables wafting from the kitchen. The dinner ladies stood ready, ladles in hand, serving portions onto sturdy, divided plastic trays. There were the regulars, shepherd's pie with a mountain of mash, sausages swimming in gravy, and on Fridays, the much-loved chips. But the real stars were the puddings, syrup sponge, treacle tart, or the legendary pink custard poured generously over jam sponge. The hall was a chorus of clattering cutlery, shouted conversations, and the occasional scrape of a chair. You learned quickly who the generous servers were, the ones who'd slip you an extra roast potato when no one was looking. School dinners were a mix of comfort and mystery. Some days the meat was tender and tasty. Other days you weren't entirely sure what it was. But it didn't matter. This was part of the fabric of school life. Those trays were heavy, easy to balance but impossible to spill without making a scene. And when you sat down with friends, tucking into that steaming plate, it felt like a break from lessons, a time to laugh, share, and maybe trade a pudding for an extra chip. Number 10. The smell of plasticine. If there was a single smell that could take you straight back to primary school, it might be plasticine. Those stiff, rectangular blocks sat in shallow boxes, the colors stacked neatly, at least until a dozen eager hands pulled them apart. It was always cold and firm at first, and you'd have to knead it for a while to make it soft enough to shape. The colors rarely stayed pure for long. Within minutes, blue mixed with yellow, red swirled into green, and inevitably the whole lot turned into that peculiar shade of brown-gray. Teachers would set projects, model houses, animals, little figurines, but just as often you ended up making snakes, balls, or nothing in particular, simply enjoying the feel of it in your hands. The smell was unmistakable, sweet and slightly waxy, and it clung to your fingertips long after the lesson ended. Sometimes little crumbs of plasticine would get stuck under your nails or pressed into the floor, where they'd live for weeks. And even now, decades later, one whiff of that scent could make you remember the exact sound of your classmates chatting, the scrape of chairs, and the joy of creating something, anything, from that colorful clay. Number 9. Ink-stained fingers. No matter how careful you were, by the end of the day your hands told the story. Blue smudges on your fingers, a blot on your cuff, maybe even a streak across your cheek if you'd absent-mindedly scratched your face. Ballpoint pens were common by the 70s, but they weren't perfect. The small crack in the barrel or a leaky cartridge could turn a simple spelling test into an inky disaster. Fountain pens were even trickier. If you pressed too hard, the nib would scratch and spray tiny dots of blue across your work. And if you forgot to screw the cap on tightly, your bag could end up with a permanent stain. A badge of honor, in a way. Teachers always seemed to have clean hands, which made you wonder if they'd mastered some secret technique. For the rest of us, the only solution was scrubbing hard with cold water at the sink, leaving your skin dry and red. There was something honest about those stains. They showed you'd been working, really working. And in a strange way, they felt like proof you belonged in that little world of books, paper, and endless handwriting practice. Number 8. Film reels for science class. When the trolley rolled in carrying the film projector, you knew the lesson was about to change. The blinds would be pulled, the light switched off, and a hush would fall over the room. The whir of the reel starting up was oddly soothing, like the sound of rain on a tin roof. The films themselves were usually in black and white, sometimes with colors that had a faint, faded look. The narrator's voice was calm, clipped, and very proper, explaining how plants made food or how the water cycle worked, in a way that felt both serious and comforting. There was always that little flicker in the corner of the screen, the tiny imperfections in the film, dancing like fireflies. If the reel jammed, the film strip would bubble and melt before your eyes, earning a collective gasp from the class. Best of all, film lessons meant less writing. You could just sit, watch, and maybe daydream a little without getting caught. But even then, something about those reels stuck with you. Maybe it was the dim light, the hum of the machine, or the way learning suddenly felt like a trip to the cinema, even if the movie was about photosynthesis. Number 7.
radiators that were always too hot. Every classroom seemed to have one, a big cast-iron radiator clanking and hissing like an old kettle. In the depths of winter, when your fingers were stiff with cold, it was a savior. You'd lean against it during break, feeling the warmth seep through your jumper until it almost burned. Sometimes the heat was too much. Sitting near it in a lesson meant spending the whole hour fidgeting, trying to cool down while your face flushed red. Teachers never seemed to notice, or maybe they liked it that way. These radiators weren't just heaters, they were little community spots. Kids would sneak over to toast a sandwich wrapped in foil or dry soggy gloves after a rainy walk to school. They had their own soundtrack too, gurgles, bangs, and the occasional loud clank that made the whole class jump. And of course, every school had that one kid who dared to press their palm against the metal for as long as possible, coming away with a pink imprint. They were part of the classroom's heartbeat, always there, always humming, a reminder that even in the draftiest of old buildings there was a place to thaw out.
Number 6. The cane and corporal punishment. It's hard to imagine now, but in the 1970s, the cane was still a real looming presence in British schools. Even if you never felt it yourself, you knew someone who had. The stories spread quickly, whispered at break time, retold with exaggerated details, always ending with a dramatic 6 of the best. The cane wasn't brandished often, but its very existence carried weight. It lived in the headmaster's office, sometimes hanging in plain view, thin and slightly curved. Just the sound of "go and see the headmaster" was enough to make your stomach knot. For teachers, it was considered part of discipline. For pupils, it was the ultimate line you didn't cross. And yet there was a strange unspoken understanding. The fear kept the rules intact. Looking back now, it feels like a different world. A world where the swish of a cane across a desk could silence a room, and where punishment was physical, not just a stern letter home. Some say it built respect, others say it built resentment. But for those who lived... Number 5. Assembly with hymns. The morning assembly was a daily rhythm, a coming together of the whole school in the main hall. You'd shuffle in with your classmates, the smell of floor polish and warm radiators filling the air. The head teachers stood at the front, papers in hand, ready to make announcements. Behind them, the upright piano waited, its top stacked with well-worn hymn books. When the first notes rang out, hundreds of young voices joined in. All things bright and beautiful, or morning is broken, would swell through the wall. Some children singing with gusto, others mumbling just enough to avoid being noticed. Pages in the hymn books were soft and frayed from years of turning, the corners curling like dried leaves. Assemblies weren't just about religion, they were about community. You heard school news, celebrated birthdays, or listened to moral tales that made you think, even if you didn't realize it at the time. And there was always that hush afterward, when the final chord faded and the head teacher's voice cut through the air. You may go to your classes. It felt like the official start of the day, one that for a few minutes had everyone breathing in the same rhythm.
Number 4. School milk in small bottles. Every morning, just before break, the classroom door would open and in came the milk crates, rattling metal frames carrying rows of tiny glass bottles, each sealed with a silver foil top. For some, it was a treat. For others, a mild form of torture. In the winter, the milk was ice cold and fresh. In the summer, if the crates sat too long in the sun, it could be, well, let's just say, slightly tangy. You jab your straw through the foil with a satisfying pop and take that first sip. Sometimes you'd blow into the straw just to make bubbles, earning a glare from the teacher. If you were lucky, you'd snag an extra bottle if a classmate didn't want theirs. This was the era before Margaret Thatcher, then Education Secretary, famously cut free school milk for older children in 1971, an act that earned her the nickname Thatcher the Milk Snatcher. That decision became part of classroom law. Looking back, those little bottles weren't just about nutrition. They were a shared ritual. The sound of foil tearing, the clink of glass, the smell of fresh milk, tiny, everyday moments that tied an entire generation together. Number 3. The overhead projector. The OHP, or OHP, felt like something from the future when it rolled into the classroom. Big, boxy, and humming softly, it cast a brilliant beam of light that cut through the dust motes in the air. Teachers would lay down a transparent acetate sheet covered in handwriting or diagrams, and suddenly the wall bloomed with glowing words and pictures. You'd watch the teacher's hand hover over the glass, their pen squeaking as they circled important points, the shadow of their hand sometimes blocking the view. The magic was that the whole class could see the same thing at once, and it felt different from just copying notes from the blackboard. But the OHP had its quirks. The bulb would overheat, the fan would whine, and sometimes the writing would appear upside down because someone forgot to flip the sheet. And then there were the leftover markings from a previous lesson, a ghostly map of Britain faintly visible beneath today's maths problem. For all its clunkiness, the OHP was a little piece of theatre. The room dimmed, the projector clicked on, and suddenly even a boring lesson on plant cells felt like a grand presentation. Number 2. The blackboards and chalk dust. Before whiteboards, before smart screens, there was the blackboard, big, dark, and looming at the front of the room like the guardian of knowledge. Every morning, the teacher would pick up a stick of chalk and start the day's lessons with a series of squeaks and scratches. There was an art to writing neatly in chalk, and the best teachers had a steady hand that made perfect letters evenly spaced across the board. And then there was the chalk dust. It clung to everything: the teacher's gown, your fingertips, the cuffs of your jumper if you dared to lean too close. If you were on board cleaning duty, you'd take the felt erasers outside and clap them together, sending up little clouds that drifted into the air like smoke. In the low sun, the particles sparkled before settling into your hair. Of course, blackboards also had their quirks. They could never be wiped completely clean. Faint ghosts of yesterday's sums and spelling lists always lingered, a reminder of what you'd learned before. And there was something oddly comforting about the sound of chalk breaking mid-word, a tiny, imperfect human moment in the middle of a perfectly planned lesson. Number 1. Wooden desks with inkwells. If you went to school in Britain in the 1970s, you'll remember those solid wooden desks, heavy enough that 2 pupils could barely shift them. They weren't just furniture, they were little time capsules. Each desk had its own history etched into the surface. Initials carved by some long-gone troublemaker, doodles of football teams, or little hearts scratched with a compass. And then there was the inkwell hole. By the 70s, the fountain pen era was fading, but the holes remained, round and smooth from decades of use. Nobody filled them with ink anymore. Instead, they became secret hiding spots for marbles, folded notes, or bits of pencil lead you were saving for later. The lids lifted with a creak, revealing the slightly musty smell of old exercise books. If you were lucky, you sat at a desk that had just the right tilt so your handwriting flowed neatly. If you weren't, your ruler kept sliding off the slant. Sometimes during a long lesson, you'd run your fingers over the grooves and wonder about the children who'd sat there before you. In a way, those desks were like old storytellers. They held everyone's little secrets, but never told a soul.
Looking back, those 1970s classrooms were more than just places to learn. They were little worlds where friendships were formed, patience was tested, and tiny everyday moments became lifelong memories. The smell of chalk, the sound of hymn books closing, the warmth of a radiator on a cold morning, they've stayed with us far longer than the facts we memorized or the tests we took. We didn't realize it then, but those days were shaping us, teaching resilience, kindness, and the value of simple joys. The world has changed, but the echo of those moments still lives in the hearts of all who sat in those wooden desks. Which of these memories brought you straight back? Share your stories below. We'd love to hear them. And if you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more journeys into the past.